There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with making an entire planet laugh. It is the loneliness of the man backstage, still in costume, exhausted to the bone, watching the audience pour out of the theater with smiles on their faces, smiles he put there, while he himself feels hollowed out, uncertain, and quietly desperate to be someone else entirely. For most of his career, Rowan Atkinson lived inside that loneliness. The world saw Mr. Bean. They saw the rubbery face, the catastrophic mishaps, the childlike genius stumbling through a world that never quite made sense to him. What they did not see was the man behind the character. A man who stuttered so severely as a boy that classmates thought something was fundamentally wrong with him. A man who spent decades convinced he was a fraud. And a man who found, to his own bewilderment, that the only place he ever felt free was when he ceased to be himself entirely. Now, at 70 years old, Rowan Atkinson has begun to speak. Not in the bumbling, wordless pantomime of Mr. Bean, but in his own voice. Careful, thoughtful, and carrying the weight of a life spent performing truths he could never quite say out loud. What he has confirmed in recent years has stunned fans who thought they knew everything about the man behind the most universally recognized comedic face of the 20th century. The revelations are not scandalous in the tabloid sense. They are something more profound than that. They are the confessions of a deeply private man finally making peace with a legacy he spent most of his life running from. To understand Rowan Atkinson at 70, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of Mr. Bean, or Blackadder, or the Edinburgh Fringe triumphs, but the very beginning. A farm in County Durham, a quiet household with 4 boys, and a child who could not get his words out without them betraying him. Rowan Sebastian Atkinson was born on January 6, 1955, the youngest son of a farming family in Consett. His childhood was stable and modest by most measures, shaped by countryside discipline and Northern English reserve. But from around the age of 5, something complicated his world in ways that would take decades to fully understand. He developed a severe stutter. In isolation, a childhood stutter is a common enough affliction. Many children experience some form of speech difficulty and move through it. But Rowan's was not mild, and he did not move through it quickly. At Durham Choristers' School, where he was sent as a young boy, the stutter made him a target. Children can be astonishingly cruel in the way that only the innocent can be, without malice, perhaps, but with devastating precision. They mocked him. Some called him an alien, a label that carried a particular sting for a child who was already sensitive, already more comfortable watching the world than participating in it. Among those classmates at a school nearby was a young boy named Tony Blair, who would later recall the particular harshness of those social hierarchies. Rowan did not fit neatly into any of them. What saved him, and this is the part of the story that feels almost too poetic to be true, was performance. Somewhere in those early years, Rowan discovered that when he stepped onto a stage, when he became someone or something other than himself, the stutter vanished. It did not struggle and fade. It simply disappeared, as though it belonged to Rowan Atkinson, the shy farm boy, and had no claim whatsoever on whoever he became when the lights came up. This discovery was not just personally significant. It was architecturally important to everything that followed. The stutter, the escape from the stutter through performance, and the characters born from that escape. These 3 things form the hidden spine of one of the greatest careers in the history of comedy. He was, academically, formidable. Whatever the stutter cost him socially, it did nothing to diminish an extraordinary mind. He excelled in science, earned strong marks throughout school, and went on to study electrical and electronic engineering at Newcastle University, graduating in 1975. Everyone around him, teachers, family, peers, assumed this was his trajectory. Engineering. Precision. A sensible, respectable career built on logic and systems. He continued postgraduate studies at Oxford's Queen's College, beginning work toward a doctorate, surrounded by some of the finest academic minds in Britain. His professors found him unremarkable in seminars. On stage, he was something else altogether. Oxford was the crucible. It was there that Rowan joined the university's drama society and fell in with a group of writers and performers who would change the shape of British comedy forever. One of them was a young Richard Curtis, who would go on to write 4 Weddings and a Funeral, Notting Hill, and Love Actually, but who at this point was simply a clever undergraduate astonished by the strange, almost alien quality of Rowan's physical comedy. Curtis later recalled watching Rowan in rehearsals, this quiet and unremarkable young man who seemed almost to disappear in conversation, and then seeing him step forward and become something that had no easy comparison. There was a driving sketch. There was a synchronized mime and speaking routine. There was an originality of physical imagination that left audiences genuinely not knowing whether to laugh or simply stare. In 1976, Rowan performed at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe with the Oxford Revue, and the response confirmed what his small circle of collaborators already suspected. He was not merely talented. He was something rarer. The Fringe audiences, sophisticated and often difficult to impress, recognized immediately that they were watching a performer unlike any they had encountered. The engineer from Durham had found his Real laboratory, and the experiments he was running there were extraordinary. The years between Oxford and his first real television breakthrough were not easy. The BBC, that enormous and occasionally bewildering institution, did not initially know what to do with Rowan Atkinson. His kind of comedy, largely physical, deeply strange, resistant to easy categorization, did not fit neatly into the formats commissioners understood. He was rejected repeatedly. Auditions were particularly grueling, because auditions require you to be yourself, and being himself meant the stutter returned with full force. There is a painful irony in this. The man who would one day make 900 million people laugh during a single Olympic ceremony could barely get through a meeting with a television executive without his own voice betraying him. He thought, more than once, about going back to engineering. The stability of it must have been appealing, a world of problems with solvable answers, of systems that behaved according to knowable rules. Comedy offered none of that, but something held him. Partly it was the discovery he had already made about the stutter, that characters could speak for him, that disappearing into a role unlocked a version of himself that was fluent, free, and fearless. Partly it was the friendships he had built, particularly with fellow Oxford alumnus Angus Deaton, who understood Rowan's rhythms and could play the straight-faced foil that Rowan's physical comedy required. And partly, perhaps, it was simply that the stage had ruined him for anything else. Once you know what it feels like to make a room full of strangers love you, the mathematics of engineering can seem very quiet indeed. The breakthrough, when it came, arrived in pieces rather than all at once. A BBC Radio 3 series in 1979. A return to the Edinburgh Fringe the same year with a mostly silent show inspired by the great Buster Keaton, a performance that divided audiences. Some walked out, others stayed and recognized they were watching something genuinely new. A television pilot called Canned Laughter, which introduced an early prototype of a character Rowan had been developing in his mind since Oxford. A strange, largely wordless figure who interacted with the modern world with the bewildered incomprehension of someone who had never quite learned its rules. The pilot did not get picked up, but the character survived. Then came Not the 9 O'Clock News, the BBC satirical sketch show that launched in 1980 alongside Pamela Stephenson, Mel Smith, and Griff Rhys-Jones. Its debut was inauspicious. The launch was delayed by a general election. When it finally aired, barely anyone watched, and the critics who did found little to celebrate. One reviewer, with the particular cruelty of a person who does not understand what they are looking at, called it the worst half-hour of television ever made. And yet the BBC, credit where it is due, kept faith. A controller believed in what the show was trying to do and ordered a second series. That decision changed British comedy permanently. What followed was a period of astonishing creative productivity. Not the 9 O'Clock News became a sensation. Within the show's run emerged one sketch that transcended the format entirely, Gerald the Gorilla, in which Rowan, dressed in a gorilla suit, delivered a brilliantly unhinged outburst of primate fury that became, in the pre-internet meaning of the word, viral. It was quoted, discussed, and awarded. Scientists adopted a piece of its nomenclature into actual informal academic usage, referring to groups of baboons as a flange, exactly as the sketch had jokingly suggested. This is perhaps the strangest form of cultural impact a comedy sketch has ever achieved, but it perfectly captures the peculiar, genre-defying quality of Rowan's comedy at its best, simultaneously absurd and oddly authoritative. By 1983, Rowan was ready for a larger canvas. The Blackadder, which he co-created with Richard Curtis, was a medieval historical comedy of epic ambition and equally epic initial failure. Filmed on location at Alnwick Castle, it was expensive, weather-plagued, critically lukewarm, and nearly cancelled. What saved it was an international Emmy, and what transformed it was a willingness to completely reimagine the format. When Blackadder 2 arrived in 1986, Ben Elton had joined the writing team, the budget had been slashed, and something remarkable had happened. The constraints had forced the show to become better. The comedy sharpened. The characters deepened. Miranda Richardson's maniacal Queen Elizabeth became one of the great comedy creations of the decade. Rowan's Edmund Blackadder evolved from bumbling schemer into razor-tongued, cynical genius, the kind of character who survives by wit alone in a world determined to destroy him. The series that followed, Blackadder Goes Forth, set in the trenches of the First World War, achieved something that almost no comedy has ever managed. It made people laugh and then, in its final 2 minutes, stopped them cold. The image of the characters charging over the top into no man's land, moving in slow motion as the screen fades to a field of poppies, remains one of the most quietly devastating endings in the history of British television. Behind the scenes, Rowan later said, "This was the project that felt most genuinely collaborative, most free of the anxiety that dogged so much of his career." He, Hugh Laurie, Tony Robinson, and Stephen Fry had built something together, and the trust between them made the work feel lighter than it was. And then came the character that would outlast everything else. The character that the boy who was called an alien had, in some deep and unspoken way, been building toward since the moment he first stepped on a stage and felt his stutter fall away. Mr. Bean arrived on British television on January 1st, 1990. The first episode drew over 13 million viewers. Rowan had been developing the character since his Oxford days, a nearly wordless figure of magnificent incompetence, a man-child loose in the modern world, whose relationship with ordinary objects and situations was one of permanent, baffled warfare. The genius of Mr. Bean was its universality. Because the character barely spoke, because the comedy lived almost entirely in the face and body, it required no translation. It played in 245 countries. Episodes reached audiences that British television had never previously touched. The trouble with Mr. Bean alone was watched by nearly 19 million people in the United Kingdom. Globally, the numbers became almost incomprehensible. And yet, here is the truth that Rowan Atkinson has finally, at 70, confirmed fully and without equivocation. Playing Mr. Bean was one of the most painful professional experiences of his life. This is the revelation that fans have found most difficult to absorb because it cuts against everything the character represents. Mr. Bean is pure delight. He is the comedy of innocence, of a creature uncontaminated by self-consciousness, stumbling through existence with cheerful, catastrophic obliviousness. How could performing that character be painful? The answer lies precisely in the nature of the performance. Because Mr. Bean speaks so rarely, because the comedy lives almost entirely in physical expression, every single moment of every single episode had to be built through the body and the face alone. Rowan had to push his physicality to extremes with each shoot, contorting, timing, sustaining expressions and postures and reactions that demanded extraordinary muscular and psychological effort. When the camera stopped rolling, he did not feel the satisfaction of a scene well played. He felt emptied, drained, as though the character had consumed something from him that did not come back straight away. He has spoken, in interviews over the years, and with increasing directness as he has grown older, about the emotional exhaustion that accompanied every Mr. Bean production. On The Graham Norton Show in 2018, he said that filming the series left him feeling constantly inadequate, as though he were never quite achieving what he was reaching for. He carried the weight of an audience of hundreds of millions who adored the character, while privately feeling uncertain whether he was serving it well enough. This combination, colossal external validation and persistent internal doubt, is a particular form of psychological torment that high-achieving, deeply perfectionist people know well. For Rowan, it was a constant companion throughout the Bean years. The 1997 Bean film, which earned over $250 million worldwide and broke UK box office records before it had even opened in America, should have felt like triumph. In many ways it did, but it also deepened Rowan's complicated relationship with the character he had created. The success meant there was no escape. Mr. Bean had become bigger than any single man could comfortably carry. The animated series, launched in 2002, offered partial relief. Voicing the character was significantly less physically demanding than embodying him, and the cartoon kept the franchise alive for younger audiences who were discovering Bean for the first time, producing new episodes as recently as 2024. But the live-action Bean had taken a genuine toll. The final major chapter of Rowan Atkinson as Mr. Bean came in 2012 at the opening ceremony of the London Olympics. Nearly 27 million people watched in the United Kingdom. Worldwide, the audience reached approximately 900 million. The sequence, Bean at a keyboard, distracted, disruptive, eventually dreaming himself into the race he was supposed to be accompanying musically, was an instant global moment, replayed across every platform, celebrated in virtually every country. It was also, Rowan has quietly acknowledged, physically exhausting in ways that took weeks to recover from. Many who follow his career closely now regard that performance as something close to a farewell, even if it was never officially announced as one. Away from the comedy, the personal life of Rowan Atkinson has been quieter, but not without its own turbulence. He met Sunetra Sastry in the late 1980s when she was working as a makeup artist on the Blackadder set. The story goes that Rowan actually requested a change of makeup artist specifically to create an opportunity to speak with her, a gesture of romantic ingenuity that reportedly disappointed Stephen Fry, who had harbored his own intentions in that direction. They married in February 1990 in New York, with Fry serving as best man. Their children, Lily and Benjamin, were born in 1993 and 1995 respectively. For nearly a quarter of a century, the marriage was a stable constant in Rowan's otherwise turbulent professional life. The separation in 2014 and the divorce finalized the following year brought a wave of press attention that Rowan found deeply uncomfortable. His relationship with actress Louise Ford, significantly younger than him and herself previously in a relationship with comedian James Acaster, generated the kind of tabloid coverage that he had always worked hard to avoid. Their daughter, Isla, was born in 2017, making Rowan a father for the third time at 62. He has kept that family life as private as he is able, consistent with a personality that has always regarded public attention as something to be managed rather than sought. There have been other glimpses of the man behind the performances over the years. In 2001, on a private flight over Kenya with his family, the pilot lost consciousness midair. Rowan, holding no flight qualifications of any kind, took hold of the controls and kept the plane stable until the pilot revived and was able to bring them safely to land in Nairobi. The story received relatively little attention at the time, which perhaps suited Rowan perfectly. He has never performed heroism well, only the comedy of it. In 2012, he used his public platform in a more deliberate way, delivering a speech in the House of Lords defending freedom of speech and arguing against the over-criminalization of offensive expression. The speech was measured, principled, and characteristically precise in its reasoning. The clips circulated widely. The relevant law was subsequently amended, a fact that Rowan has not dwelt upon publicly, but which represents perhaps the most tangible real-world impact any comedian has had on British legislation in recent memory. In June 2023, he wrote a piece for The Guardian questioning whether electric vehicles were as environmentally clean as their advocates claimed, arguing that the emissions generated in their manufacturing process were substantially higher than most people understood.